today we chose the topic of shades of green, valuing and protecting Singapore's green spaces. So this topic, I believe, is quite timely. Timely because the Green Plan has been announced. There's been a number of very interesting discussions and debate on green spaces related to the Dover Forest, for example. So we are quite honored today to have the opportunity to hear thoughts from three very distinguished speakers. So David, can we move to the next slide? So today we have three illustrious and distinguished speakers who will share their views on this topic. On the left, we have Dr. Ngo Kang Min. Dr. Ngo is a research coordinator at the Asian School of the Environment, Nanyang Technological University. She focuses on tropical trees, forest dynamics, carbon stock, and ecology. Her research sites include the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, Central Nature Reserves, parks, and streets. Her research interests include social perceptions of nature among urbanites like Singaporeans. So quite interesting research environment for Kang Min. She chairs the Butterfly and Insect Group at Nature Society Singapore, an NGO dedicated to nature conservation and education in Singapore. And she obtained her PhD from the Tokyo Metropolitan University. We also have with us Professor Sing Tien Foo. Professor Sing is the director at the Institute of Real Estate and Urban Studies, National University of Singapore. He sits on various boards such as the Asian Real Estate Society. He also serves as a member of the panel of assessors of the Appeal Board Land Acquisition and is a member of the Valuation Review Board. He co-authored 3 books. One of the books, Kiasunomics, has been nominated for the Best Non-Fiction title at the Singapore Book Award 2018. And it was also the 2nd bestseller non-fiction in Times chart and the 4th bestseller of the Asian chart of W.H. Smith. Professor Singh's research interests includes real estate behavioral economics, real estate finance, and investment analysis and housing markets and policies. He obtained his doctor in philosophy from the University of Cambridge. Adjunct Associate Professor Khoo Peng Beng is our 3rd distinguished speaker. He is the director of Arc Studio Architecture and Urbanism. He co-founded his company back in 1999 with his wife, Belinda. Among his many notable achievements include being the 3-time winner of the President's Design Award for the 1000 Singapore's project, the Pinnacle at Duxton, and the Tembusu. His current interests include developing projects for a truly human city that incorporates ecology, mobility, care programs, energy, architecture, and technology, so that we balance life support services of our planet and the extreme human needs of our generation. So he's a truly multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary subject matter expert, and we are interested to hear what he has to say today. He graduated from National University of Singapore with the Board of Architects Award for the best final year thesis in 1993. So ladies and gentlemen, please let's give all our speakers a warm virtual welcome. So today, what will happen is we have spoken to our speakers and they've kindly put together a deck of slides which they will be sharing of their thoughts on this topic for about 5 minutes or so. After each sharing, we will then go into a discussion. As you know, you have completed a poll questions. We will then show the poll questions after that. And finally, we'll open up to for Q&A. So with that, I would like to just pass the baton over to Kang Min. Would you like to take it off and start with your thoughts and your slides?
Sure, thank you, Waslam. Very happy to be with everyone here tonight. So let me share my slides now. Everyone can see? Okay. So thanks for the introduction. Before I go deep into any topic, I always like to find out more about the history of that issue, because I believe that understanding our history puts our current situation in context, and it can help us, think about our future better. So I will start by showing this map of pre-British Singapore. You can still recognize the shape of Singapore, but at that time, most of the island was still forested. It was mostly lowland forests with some freshwater swamps and mangroves at the fringes. Then when the British came in 1819, there were lots of first-generation immigrants that came to Singapore to make a living. Some of them went into agriculture. So the cultivation of crops like gambia, which is the plant on the left, and pepper started. And gambia in those days was used as a tanning agent for tanning leather. And it was also used as a herbal medicine. Okay, but the production of gambia is very resource intensive. First, they need to clear the forest to make space for the plantations. And because extracting the tannin from the gambia leaves, you need to boil them in water. So an equal area of forest needs to be cleared for the firewood. And so obviously there's a limited supply of firewood within any given area of forest. And this method of agriculture, very quickly depletes the soil of its nutrients. And the cleared land is rapidly exhausted, and the farmers have to move to another fresh area of forest to farm on. So, the land that they leave behind ends up being very depleted, but if left alone, it can develop into a secondary forest. So then this was a slide I was supposed to show you, the gambia and the pepper plantations. So then we have the second wave of deforestation, and that was when rubber came along. That was in the 1900s when rubber became an important commodity. So rubber is a tree species from South America, and its latex or sap is tapped for making insulation materials. So rubber plantations also require a lot of land to cultivate, and so some of these secondary forests from the previous century got cut again to make these rubber plantations. And in fact, if you visit current parks like Dairy Farm Nature Park or Windsor Nature Park, you will still see these remnant rubber trees that got left behind. So the agricultural practices I mentioned above resulted in the removal of a lot of our primary forests in Singapore. So in fact, most of the forests that you see at the Central Nature Reserves, which is like Macritchie and Pierce, are a result of this unsustainable agriculture. And so those secondary forests are actually more than 100 years old, but they still have not fully recovered from the destruction after so many years. So if you're not familiar with the terminology, secondary forest refers to forests that developed after the removal of the primeval or the original forest. So this new secondary forest, we call it Beluga forest because it features long-lived pioneer species or tree species that are able to tolerate these very poor soils that get left behind by agriculture. But these forests, they tend to stagnate, meaning that there will be those few species that can survive these harsh conditions, and they will go on to grow for many decades. But many of the other species in primary forests, for some reason, they are not able to grow there. And that's why even these secondary forests that are more than 100 years old, they get sort of stuck in their recovery process. So let's move on to more recent times, the last few decades. So since independence, a lot of secondary forests, swamps and mangroves in Singapore have been cleared to make way for urban development, especially in the non-CBD areas like Jurong, Sungai Kadut, and Kallang. So the picture on the right shows the most recent mega residential project, which is the Tengah Forest Town. It's actually a project in which actually a lot of forest is being removed to make these new flats. So here's a map of recent Singapore, and I put the prehistoric map on the left as a reference. So you can see there are quite a big differences. Besides the lower amount of green on the recent map, we also expanded our coastline, especially on the southern coast of the main island. So what kind of green do we have these days? You know, we have forests, we have parks, we have streets lined with trees in neat rows, but are they all equal? So what I want to show here is a study done by this researcher, Dr. Joanne Q, who found that most Singaporeans actually prefer the park setting, which is the manicured landscape look, which is box number C. Even though, you know, the same Singaporeans also say that, oh yeah, it's really important to conserve biodiversity, but what most of them don't realize is that actually it is the forest that holds most of our diversity. It is box A that has the most diversity. So when you hear news articles or saying that, you know, we have so and so number of native species of plants or animals in Singapore, you know, chances are those species are actually coming from the forest reserves like Bukit Timah and MacRitchie. So finally, I want to show you this scene of the first weekend after the announcement of the reopening of Bukit Timah, the Bukit Timah stretch of the rail corridor. So this is, I recognize this as part of the part going south of King Albert Park MRT. So I've been to this stretch myself quite a few times, and usually on a weekday, there are still people, but not crowded like this. You know, so this is a video actually on the right side. I'm gonna play it. Yeah, so this stretch, you know, when I go there on a weekday, there are people walking, running, cycling, but I can still see a lot of the floor or the ground. And here in this photo and video, you can hardly see the ground, which means that it's overcrowded. And, you know, when you go there in a situation like this, you're probably not going to enjoy it. You know, it's not going to be optimum. And so my takeaway from these images is that Singapore needs more wilder green spaces. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kang Min.
Let me end my...
Good introduction with a bit of history just to give us some context. I'd like to just ask if Professor Singh, are you ready to share your screen?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, give me a minute. So let me share my screen.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, can you all see the slide? Okay, good evening. Thanks again, Green SG Collective, for inviting me. Some of you may have heard me before on real estate news and housing market policy, but I think close to my heart is still the issue on research on green. So I'm on this topic, shape on green, valuing and protecting Singapore green space. First of all, maybe as an economy, usually we need to ask, we always ask this question about the trade-off between green space preservation and developments, and what is the trade-off and what cost? Does economic growth actually hurt or help the urban environments? I think just now Dr. Ngo has mentioned about this Dover Forest kind of debate. So basically this, from the economic points of view, we are actually trying to argue on the issue of whether this economic growth and environment protection, can they coexist, or whether is there any trade-off between the two? So what can an economist say is, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an ecologist. From ecology points of view, usually they're trying to measure how rich the biodiversity, how to preserve and promote the preservation of some of these biodiversity, green environments and forests and so on. And Ping Ping later on, as an architect, you're probably looking at it from the design, green environments and perspective. And I'm also not a public health expert. We are not trying here to find a solution how to reduce these pollutions, environment kind of pollution and so on. And and I'm also not an engineer because we're not here to judge whether green technology is most promising or what type of green technology will be more efficient and so on. However, as economists, actually, the training of economists, usually we're trying to look at the issue from different perspectives. One of the areas that usually we look at is what is cost and benefit trade-off between green and green environments, green buildings, for example, incorporating different dimensions of this green feature into the buildings, and whether it's existing building, new buildings, or retrofitted buildings. The other issue we are actually quite concerned is we tend to simulate certain behavior by changing certain conditions, for example, behavioral interventions and so on, how this can improve or raise the probability of people making, going for the green kind of decision, right? As a context, maybe just let me put this curve. This is a very common curve that we use in economics, trying to argue about the trade-off between economic growth and environment protections, what we call the environmental Kuznets curve, EKC in short. Basically, it hypothesized that there's a non-monotonous or non-linear kind of relationship between development and environment quality. By having more development, it does not necessarily mean the environment quality will be degraded or degenerated. If you can see that environment development at the beginning, initially, it helped to, basically, it actually causes more pollution at the beginning. And because of the growth and the scale of productions and consumption, because when people become, the income increase, development growth increase, and so on, there's a tendency of productions and consumption rates to increase as well. That's an initial stage. When the growth reaches a certain, what we call the inflection point, when you look at the curve, when you reach this inflection point, in other words, when we reach certain level of income or wealth, further development usually lead to a trade-off. In other words, the trigger offsetting effect by shifting to greener consumption, greener productions, and so on. And we can see that, further increase in the economic growth or incomes can lead to a reduction in pollution or environmental quality increase subsequently. That's why we see this EKC, environmental Kuznets curve, which follow a non-linear, or we call it convex kind of shape. So you can see here per capita income or per capita GDP. When per capita GDP increase, it does not necessarily mean that pollution will become worsen. It will be worsened after that. So when we reach certain income level, we can see actually environmental kind of protection, environmental concern become more imminent. Just like, for example, you can see here, these are the two different cars. One is on your left-hand side is a Prius. This is a hybrid car, more environmental friendly, but the cost is much more expensive. And then on the other hand, there are normal fuel car, which is slightly cheaper. So when, there's always a trade-off, because whether you are more, when your income increase, you're actually willing to pay a little more to have this hybrid car, which is more environmental friendly and so on. This actually illustrate a little bit about this EKC, right? And if you look at some of the data, some of the trends, you can see here this blue line and the purple line here represent the world economics, the world average GNI, gross national income per capita, which is a purple line here. And then there's also, I also superimpose on this chart the CO2 emission, because CO2 emission is an indicator of the pollution, level of pollution. You can see here when the economy increase, on average, the world average economy increase over time, and then pollution level increase as well. But if you look at Singapore curve, the other yellow line is actually Singapore curve. Singapore income and GNI per capita actually increased quite steeply, especially after 1990. We can see in terms of CO2 emission, actually CO2 emissions seem to have a negative kind of kind of relationship. In other words, the CO2 actually decreased when actually the GNI, in other words, the income level become higher. So in other words, if you look at this curve, Singapore actually follow quite closely the EKC, the environmental Kushner curve. In other words, Singapore becoming greener than the average of the world in this case. You look at this. How about other countries? Let's look at US. In fact, in the US, it's the same thing. If you look at the green line, in fact, US, the income level has also increased quite steeply. And then we can see this CO2 emission. Actually, there's some decline in the CO2, but it's not as steep compared to Singapore case. As you can see, the city quality become more and more important, and especially when the income level increase. How about the other Asian, the most populous country in Asia, China and India? India, as you can see, India is actually the green line here, below here. The income level increased, but we have not seen the CO2 level decrease, any significant trend of decrease. But in China, it's quite interesting. We can see China, in fact, after 2000, the income increased quite steeply. But we start to see that in pollution level, in other words, the CO2 has reached certain inflection point, but we are not seeing a steady trend of decrease yet. But actually, the pollution has increased over the years, but we start to see some of this inflection point. In other words, China start to value the blue sky more valuable in the sense. If you can see, this is some example how pollution can actually affect the housing value, because this is a typical cloudy day in Beijing. The PM2.5 and PM10 actually is quite poisonous, and actually people are actually quite concerned, especially those people who live in the inner circle and so on. In a study done by one of my colleague from Johns Hopkins University, Matthew Kahn and Chen Siqi in MIT, they look at some of the historical data. They find that actually, interestingly, pollution, particularly in this PM10, which is an indicator of pollution level, when PM10 increased by 10% or 10 milligram in this case per square meter, there's a negative impact on housing price. Actually, people want to move away from the polluted area, especially in the eastern part of Beijing. And we can see that there's negative impact. So when people become wealthier, actually they want to move away from this pollution. Okay, let's move on to next question about this is what we call the issue about externality. Sometimes the pollution level cannot be controlled because this can actually caused by, for example, the burning of the forest from a neighboring country. It may cause these transboundary kind of air pollution problems, and smoking is another problem. Your neighbors smoke in the HDB flat, how this can create a negative externality. So we can see the impacts, how this burning of the forest in Indonesia can cause some of the haze problem in Singapore. So how do you minimize this? What is the impact of this negative externality? Right. So this haze causes a lot of disruption in our daily life. And we can see here, Singapore has to shut down the school, and then there's smoky smoke also bring down our daily life, because a lot of people are concerned about this haze and how this affects their health. So in fact, these are some of the indicator information, because if we receive more and more of this information, people are actually aware and concerned about the haze and the health risk. This is information given up by the NEA. When haze reach certain level, by around 0 to 50, is still okay, it's again outdoor activity. When we reach the unhealthy levels, for example, when the PSI index go beyond 100 to 200 point, it becomes unhealthy level. What is the reaction? What is the response from the household? I think we are quite this information are quite important. This is what we've seen from Twitter. You can see here is this is a daily PSI indicator, and then this is what people actually discuss and share information on Twitter. Basically, this is information kind of collection. We can see that people start to tweet about this issue, haze, trying to find out a lot more information about haze risk. And not only that, not only just finding information, we also find people start to find way to mitigate or minimize or avoid this risk. What do they do? Basically, they stay indoor. This is what we found in our study. We find that during the period, there's a conscientious effort to try to avoid or try to mitigate some of these risks and public health risks. The same thing during this pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. the stay home and also circuit breaker kind of measure actually quite effective in mitigating or minimize some of the transmission risk. The same thing here in this study, we've shown that during the haze period, a lot of households actually stay indoor because what we can see, basically their water consumption increase during the weekend. You know, usually during the weekend you go out to the mall, to the park, and so on. You don't stay at home. But during the haze period, actually, you find that water consumption actually increase. What does it imply? Basically, people are actually staying indoor more and also washing more and taking shower and so on, trying to minimize some to avoid some of these risks. This is another interesting example about this negative externality. We call it this tragedy in commons. This is an example we heard recently about Japanese government planning to discharge some of these treated nuclear water from the Fukushima Daiichi plant into the Pacific Ocean. And this is a problem. Sometimes we call this free rider problem. When there's no property right, there's no control on this common property, especially ocean. So this can cause a lot of environmental impact. The same thing, like for example, greenhouse gas emission is another typical problem of free rider problem. How do you solve these problems? This is very tricky and very complicated issue. People have been thinking about introducing carbon trading, whether this can be a way to solve these free rider kind of problems, right? And due to time constraint, maybe I just briefly mention about some of the governance, role of the government or urban governance. How do we minimize, how do we shift the EKC, especially toward the left, so that we can see the improvement in the environment quality? There are different ways to deal with this problem. One is through the market forces. Usually this is how it's done by pricing mechanism. We charge people for producing pollutions, emitting the carbon dioxide and so on. This pricing mechanism, and also even charging higher energy costs. When you consume more energy, you pay a higher energy price, because I think higher energy can create incentive. Sometimes it's also drive behavior as well. When the higher the energy costs, especially for example, fuel costs become more expensive, what would that happen? People not just cut down their consumption, they also drive producers or developers to think about more green technology. For example, the car manufacturing, because of high fuel costs, that's why you see a lot of these electric car, hybrid car was developed because of the incentive for this car manufacturing to adopt more green and greener technology to reduce their energy consumption. There are other mechanisms as well. Government role also important in this case, because if you leave it purely to pricing mechanism, market forces, you may not be able to reach the greening kind of objective. It may not happen as well sometimes because of various reasons. And because of market failure, information asymmetry, and also just now we mentioned about the issue about negative externality, the pure market forces cannot resolve some of these problems. So you need to have intervention, government intervention in the sense. How do government intervene? There are various ways for governments to intervene or to improve this mechanism. One is actually to, for example, they introduce green mark certification. They also try to preserve some of the market open space. The Dover Forest is one very typical example. Then you can look at our water catchment area is another important example, where without government intervention, I think the whole water catchment area will be gone and will be developed into expensive condominium and so on. So this is part of the planning initiative where government actually play a very important role. There are other mechanisms as well, other than governments, market forces, which this is another area which is very close to our research interest. This is what we call the non-pricing mechanism, because I think consumer behavior is very important. How to use non-intrusive, or how to use a mechanism that can influence consumer behavior without changing their utility function. This is something we are actually very actively researching into and want to understand a little bit more. I can show you a little bit example later on. Basically, to think globally some of these environmental issues, but we had to behave, we had to start our behavior from home, from our consumer perspective, act locally, in other words. Just I mentioned about green mark certification. This is a very important green mark scheme trying to encourage, incentivize developer or to incentivize user to adopt green mark kind of certification. Due to time, maybe I'll just move on. This is a study we've shown that during in this study, you find that you can see there are some premium actually for both public and private housing. So green mark certified buildings actually command slight premium. But I think what we are actually not sure in this study is really green marks building improve if energy efficiency, or is it because of the signal, because people paying higher premium because of their environmental kind of motive and so on. So I think there are a lot more interesting stories that we can actually look at. And the other issue I mentioned just now about the behavior intervention, this is one example where we use this to see how people respond to information. This is a shower meter, smart shower meter. By providing information, for example, water consumption and temperature, how will this influence people's shower behavior? We did this. We applied this to experiments where we involve about 500 households. We give every household a pair of these shower meter, and then we measure their water consumption over the 4 to 6 month period. We do find significant saving in terms of water consumption. There are other kind of behavior intervention which government constantly carry out. This is we call a social campaign. You try to encourage people to save energy, save water, and so on. This is another one, I think quite effective. We call it Project Carbon Zero, where the NEA actually conduct this together with school, try to encourage students to consume energy, not just consume energy, they also try to encourage a student to nudge their parents, their neighbors, their friends to consume energy. In fact, that Carbon Zero energies seems to have quite effective, is an effective campaign, but the campaign is not persistent, the effect is not persistent. In this study. The last thing I will mention is about this indoor forest. Even though, in this case, I'm not ecology, I'm not sure how these 158 species or animals and 120 endangered plants and so, but I think unlike the pollution, water pollution or air pollution, clearing and forest is what we call the irreversible kind of action. If you make the decision, this will actually, we cannot actually reverse back, these forests and so on. Unlike air pollution, when they stop burning the forest, the haze will be gone, the air can resume to the normal quality and so on. However, decision to clear the forest is irreversible. Therefore, in typical tragic or common kind of scenario, when private property rights do not exist, then therefore it's important for government to make certain intervention, in this case, whether to preserve these forests now, because if you develop it, he probably would not get back these forests as is. I think Dr. Ngo had mentioned earlier on about the impact of deforestation and so on. I think they are still, due to time, maybe I just will stop here and I will just maybe
Thank you.
Thank you,
Professor Sing. Wow,
right,
a lot of very good examples towards the end, and I think some interesting statistics.
Correct.
For all the economists here, me included. I thought it was quite interesting to see some of the charts. I was particularly intrigued with the fact that in Singapore, the inflection point started around 1989, 1990s, whereas in China, it's more recent, but it was at a GDP point of about 10,000. So, but those are good points, something we can discuss later. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I thought maybe I'll just quickly bring in Mr. Koo. Mr. Koo, are you ready to share your thoughts, and if you have any slides, your slides as well?
Hi everyone, I'm starting with this slide, and that's Belinda. My sharing today is called The Architecture of Our Common Home. I grew up in Ipoh, Malaysia, and very often I'll be outside climbing trees, and in the weekends there'll be waterfalls that I'll be jumping into, and I love the sea. So when I decided to do, architecture, it was an expression of how I could, blend art and science together. And this is interesting for me because we are at a point in history where there is a incredible amount of change and power. We are given so much, and the question is whether we know how to use what we are given responsibly. So if you just look at how human beings have occupied this planet, for millions and billions of years, we were hovering around 1.5 billion. But today, just in a very, very short period of time, we are multiplying in an amazing manner. And by 2050, we will hit 10 billion. And I hope I'll still be around. But those guys out there who's listening to these, if you're in your 20s and 30s, you will be in a position to do a lot when that time comes. But I started my career thinking, this is what people want. Everyone wants a house. We work really hard to make our homes very beautiful, and we try to put in as much love into our work as possible. But very soon, we spend a lot of time thinking about what a home is. It's a place where we want to find comfort, safety, security. A place that we can thrive, and our daily life gets improved, and it's orderly, peaceful, and it's multi-generational. You have many different generations existing in the space. But fast forward, if everyone were to live in a house like those that I've started off designing, we would not have enough land in Singapore. And I started thinking, what does it mean to thrive, and what does it mean to be happy in a city? And started to demand more from the city. I think we started off thinking, we just need to survive, around the 1965, we have nothing, we need to build this, we need to build that. But now that we have done all that, what is it that we need? We need more than just to survive. We need to thrive. We need to be happy. We need to express. And what does it mean? And at what cost? Interestingly, looking at research in social science and even neuroscience, we know, for example, that we thrive when we are in nature, whether it's small scale or large scale. Even a tiny little window garden increase the rate of recovery of heart patients. We need almost to be in nature. And when you measure happiness, Kang Min, you are right. People might choose like the orderly, pictures that they think will make them happy. But when they actually measure their heart rates and sweating level and all these kind of things, they find that when you are in the wild, is when you are actually happy. So it has to be complex, it has to be diverse, it has to have some kind of chaotic, like the mix of the wild. And we all for safety and security, etc. And this kind of environment is really not available when we do the terrace housing scheme. So I've gone through a lot of US cities that are designed based on this kind of landed housing typology. And eventually, when people grow old and they can't drive anymore, the house itself becomes a jail. The house becomes the world that confines you. Conversely, living closer together would actually be a real solution. So people in Hong Kong, for example, they live longer, they live very long, and they have community right at their doorsteps. This is because they live quite close together. So paradoxically, living further apart although it gives you privacy and all that beauty of space and all that, really doesn't actually end up making you happy, because you eventually will feel really insecure. Fast forward one more step, post um, a happy living project, we started to think about density. At the most extreme level, is there a limit to how close we can live together? So if you take Pinnacle at Duxton, we are 3 times the normal Toa Payoh density. So Pinnacle at Duxton is really about 2.5 football fields, so 2.5 hectares, and we are housing about 1,848 units. Now, if you compare these models, okay, so you take a terrace housing model and you build, the same amount, you get, this is what it's 20 times the land needed compared to Pinnacle Duxton. And if you go for a good class bungalow, it's 134 times. What does that mean? To house 7 million people at an average household of 3.1, that means all of Singapore in the future, okay? The terrace housing model, you will need 616 square kilometer of land, which means that almost the entire island is covered by terrace house, okay? And if you go for good class bungalows, finish. You need Batam, Bintan, parts of Johor to even have all your housing. But if every house was like a Pinnacle at Duxton, you only need 30.7 square kilometers, which is 4% of 710. Like, what does that look like? It looks like a little string of building that can be situated above your MRT line. That's the entire 7 million. Okay? So if you think about it like that, it changes the imagination of footprint altogether. It's no longer then a question of whatever. It's a question of desire, will, and design. Because we have shown one Pinnacle adjustment. I just need to multiply it a few 100 times more and string it around, and that's all. That's all you need. So honestly speaking, when we have this rhetoric of land scarcity and all that for housing, is that true? How much of that is true? And what are the parameters that we have put in place that has created that narrative? So if you look at, this is the picture of Singapore, we dedicate quite a bit to this maroon color, which is industry. And I think Carmen has shown the green clang, but a lot of it is this beige color thing, which is housing. Could we reduce the footprint of this housing? And if you look at land allocation in Singapore, right, primary forests are 2% only, wetland forest 1.2. So if you look at all the forests, okay, we are just looking at 16 square kilometers, 17 square kilometers. Like, it's like just a mini thing. But if you compare it to housing, industry, and even defense gets 133 square kilometers. So could we do something about all of distribution and look at this tragedy of commons that we heard from just now, and see what else can we do, what other models can we use. So this is Pinnacle Duxton. This is Tembusu, where we started creating land in the sky and connected neighborhoods in the sky. And this is the model of a town by compacting the different typologies and weaving in greenery into our town. And then I started asking myself whether that is truly enough, and what does it mean for us, Singapore? Are we just like another statistic? And no matter how hard you try, no matter how short your shower is, we will still end up being in trouble. So if you look at Singapore as a model, 1,000 Singapore. So if I could, get Pinnacle Duxton strung around the island, I multiply that 1,000 times, I can actually house 7 billion. But if you look at the land area of the world needed, basically it's 0.5% of the world land area, which is something like the size of France and something like the size of Texas, maybe 2 of Japan. That's all you need for the entire world. So the footprint that we are talking about, it can be really, really compact and really, really small, physically speaking, right? So we took this idea to Venice Biennale and had it exhibited, and we started talking about this idea of the complexity, and just looking at patterns again. This is the kind of pattern that we are looking at of urban aggregation, you know. So entire North America, 500 million, entire South America, about 500 million, Africa, India, China, 1 billion each, Europe, kind of close to a billion, but Asia, Southeast Asia is going to be another billion, okay? But Asia, just 4-hour circle, right? It's more than half the world's population clustered in and around Singapore. And we need to house another 300 million just in Southeast Asia alone by 2030. How are we going to do all that with the current business as usual and the current model? It's not going to happen. And that's why there is a mad rush. Look at this urban aggregation. Nashik, Mumbai, Pune, Shanghai, and up north in Beijing, Guangzhou, and the Kuala Lumpur Singapore corridor is already 15 million. And they all look kind of sad. So 142 Singapore's need to be in the next 15 years. That's the real challenge over here. So I look at Singapore. If we can make one Singapore work and make it green, make it, reduce the footprint, then we are really, really talking about a sustainable model that could be studied and maybe adapted and modified for other new world. So the old idea of hierarchy, the winner takes all, has to give way for the holoarchy, which is each individual, each group, each community, each locality is complete on its own and embedded inside the other in a holoarchy. So what do I mean? So if you look at Singapore, you can say is a holon. It is complete on its own, but it is at the same time dependent on others. Inside Singapore, the strategy was to create 20 over new towns. So we studied Sengkang, one of the new towns like up here. And Sengkang is broken up into 4 or 5 neighborhoods. And each of these neighborhoods is broken up into smaller different precincts. Okay, so roughly each new town is 10 square kilometers, and half of it will be used for residential area, and we will house about 150,000. So this is the follow-on. And if you go down into the precinct, then you go into the blocks. And if you look at all the blocks that Singapore HDB has ever built, we actually get a laboratory of housing typology. We even plan very carefully, like if you're single, then you get married, then you have a baby, then your parents move in, then you get rich, then you time for condo, then you shift out. But we rely on 4 times the size of Singapore for our food. So really now, if we can make our food system work, we can then start to really, really look at sustainable Singapore. But this is what happens. Forests are being cut down for food and literally killing the earth itself, all the microbes, and the sea is being killed, overfished, just for food. And are we implicated in all of this? For sure, right? Because we outsource all of these responsibilities and we don't really care about the externality. So animal agriculture is responsible for 91% of the forest destruction. All this needs to be fact checked, but it's a shocking to see. 87% of world fish species, none of these are being addressed by economics. Zero. And Kate River has started talking about the donor economy. Economics itself has to change because in the past, there is no visual of planetary boundaries, but now we have. And we can even see that the social foundation has not even been met for all of humanity, plus those that are being born. We are literally borrowing from the future. So it has become not a pure economics play, it has become a judicial play. Is justice. You can't take from the future the earth because then we are really killing ourselves. There are only three choices that we can make at this point. If you look at the way human beings, this is the Anthropocene. There are three choices. Which branch are we going to take? Human beings and the environment is finite. If you look at the human being, we are the planet, materially speaking, 65% oxygen. This carbon that happens to be inside human beings is the same carbon that existed for billions and billions of years, and the hydrogen and nitrogen. And we rely on microbes to stay alive. If we do not see ourselves as one with nature, we will continue to consume nature without seeing that we are really consuming ourselves. So the question is, how is economics going to deal with this idea of the collective individualism? What does the economics of interdependence look like? What does the economics of the commons look like? Because it is no longer okay for us to create business as usual. We can't be here anymore. We can't fight and we can't just use money as our driver. We have to look at integral columns and holistic meshwork. We have to come into a way of thinking that is post-pluralism, post-scientific rationality, into integration and the holonic future. And we've got to push ourselves to see that we are one and the same as our Earth, no longer working in fight and flight survival mode, but into analytical, neocortical stuff way of looking. So how does that change all my design? So how do I look at the world and look at the world as one integrated entity for everyone while thriving? So this becomes the challenge of the future and the challenge, the great challenge of this generation. And so I find people using straw, they cut down from paddy. This is in Africa, German company, pressing it into pots that we can build the house. I find scientists, a friend of mine, growing rice paddy on rooftop with 10% of the water, zero chemicals. All these plants are grown without using toxins. None of the water goes into the earth. Nitrogen, controlled amount, exactly what the plant needs. The technology is out there. The question is, are we going to change our hearts so that we can stop thinking that we are constantly in survival mode and constantly just consuming, constantly just being addicted to this whole idea of consuming, making really conscious choices. Okay, so this is my journey, and I'm just happy to be able to share with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Koo. Wow, that was really illuminating, and I think very interesting to hear some of the ideas and concepts. Especially with I was particularly interested in this, how you can house the whole world practically into 1,000 Singapores, though I wonder about livability.
What do it
I
look
used to
like?
live in Sengkang. Yeah, but having said that, I thought maybe what we can do is I already see some interaction in the chat. So it's really, really good that people are engaging and speakers are also engaging back. So before we get into the Q&A, I thought I'll just do a quick recap of the house rules for Q&A. Of course, you can raise your hand. There's a function in your Zoom called reactions. You can just raise your hands. I will call you out. Or if you do not wish to ask directly, you can post your questions in the chat, which some of you have done, and there have been some replies. So I might pull out one or two just to give a little bit more context. And if you need any support, please feel free to reach out to Lokman or Brian, who are our tech folks supporting this program. So perhaps I could just spotlight on the speakers and then maybe get into a few Q&A questions of my own. I think one of the common things that I picked up from this from Kang Min, your speech, Mr. Koo and Professor Singh, is that there appears to be some trend towards a greater desire of even a possibility to live a greener life, protect more of our green spaces. Clearly, from the pictures you showed of the walks in the green corridor, the crowdedness, people have a desire for that. And I think the inflection points that Professor Singh you spoke about, and architecturally speaking, Mr. Koo, you have kind of used science to show us that it is possible. But how do we solve the problem of the human want? So if I just go back to some of the basic economics I've been taught, there's this constant desire to want more. So there's always this unlimited wants that we have to deal with. How do you address that? Because that really is the one that's putting a lot of pressure on our consumption of the available resources that we have. So nudge theory has been one idea, Professor Singh, you shared, but has it worked? Our consumption today is still high, and there's a lot of food waste, for example. So I just want to start off posing these questions and open it to the floor, our panel. Who wants to take that first?
Okay, AsRES, maybe I'll just comment on this. Actually, it's true when the incomes increase, when people become wealthier, I think if you demand more, they will increase in consumption. But what's important is also the quality of these goods, or consumed goods. Actually, people demands more better quality goods, and this better quality good actually also much greener and also less pollution. So I think that's why you see this environmental Kushner curve, which actually deflate after the inflection point. We see them with the increase in income and so increase in consumption and productions, it doesn't necessarily mean that the environmental quality will actually degrade further. So I think we can see even production, for example, in the production of in terms of aircraft, when we have a bigger aircraft, but a better engine, you probably see the noise pollution actually reduce over time instead of compared to the older version of the aircraft, even though it's smaller, but actually generate a lot more noises and so on. I think this is the part of the technological advances where we can actually use technology to see how we can actually reduce some of these environmental kind of effects. Right.
Okay. Kang Min, you want to say something?
Well, actually, it's related to your question, also directed to Prof Singh. I'm curious. I'm not an economist myself, but I'm curious about what is the economic model that Singapore is using or pursuing right now. Is it a model of growth at all costs, or unlimited growth, or is it something like the donut economics that Mr. Koo had presented just now?
Basically, Singapore, as is shown earlier on, the environmental goodness, although the CO2 emission may not be the most ideal way of measuring the pollution, as I think some of you, I think Winston had mentioned greenhouse gas emission, but I think we still need to collect more data to look at whether greenhouse gas actually also reduce because of, when CO2 emission reduce. I think if you look at Singapore, it's a typical example where green environments become very, very important, even though Singapore is very urbanized, but you can still see a lot of green spaces around. So I think Bing can actually discuss and share more about the idea of having a vertical city. At the same time, we want to make sure there's enough green. That's why I think the models of Singapore being gathered in the city. Yeah.
I am super suspicious about this cosmetic because our world is finite. The number of carbon, the number of molecules and nitrogen molecules, they are all kind of like right? So the more human beings are actually pretty good carbon sequestration. We have more human beings, we can actually store carbon as well. But the thing is, having clean environment in Singapore, is that enough? And if you just take a snapshot of what's happening, just look at for example, your example, you said that Japan wanted to pump all these nuclear waste into the sea just because who is looking after the ocean? Nobody really cares, right? So similarly, if you look at all the river tributaries or all the great rivers in the world, and if you just track plastic, you will see this picture of plastic spreading. And if we are just checking waste, right? Animal waste, you will see it spreading. Now, nobody really talks about one of these things because it is just not in the radar. Like in Singapore, for example, a huge consumer of water and electricity is really the oil refineries. But they are always taken out of because it makes the most money for Singapore. So it's like you would do anything to preserve the worst thing in your stable that's making you the most money. But you are willing to sacrifice the future, sacrifice everything just to preserve your current way of doing business. And it's the same thing. If everyone went on a beef-heavy diet like the Americans, we wouldn't have enough land to grow cows for everyone. So it means that we are really eating beef at the expense of someone not eating beef for hundreds of years. It is not economics is not able to address that even at this level of equality. So we are only looking at 20% of happy rich people and then using that to apply to the entire world while we are suppressing all the rest. So if we say, okay, these are finite needs by everyone, if we share it out equally, what does that look like? And how can we create a new economics using the technology that we have that creates this equality for now and for the future as well? We can't keep borrowing from the future, and expect the problem to be solved by the future people. You can't. That is not fair.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe I think you didn't get it. But what I'm trying to say is actually the relationship between economic growth and environmental kind of quality. So I think basically what the EKC trying to say is, I think there will be there's a non-linear kind of relationship in economic growth, and then you probably do not necessarily see more pollution in the environments. So I didn't say this is a solution, but basically just describe the scenario. I think, of course, you leave it to the market, you leave it to the free rider kind of issue. This problem cannot be solved. And what is the best way to solve this issue? That's difficult to enforce a lot of this issue, even though we know there will be pollution generated from productions, from the urban development and so on. What's the best way to deal with this problem? It's not so easy to look at it. For example, greenhouse gas. How are we going to actually enforce this? Because if it's just a issue of common right, common property, and is it possible to enforce if it's the country, this, especially when you involve transboundary kind of effects, it's more difficult to enforce. And what's the best way to deal with these problems? If you don't do anything, what will happen? All right. So it's not an easy question, not just inequality, but it's also find way to deal with this problem. Technology may not be the only one. Changing behavior may be another way, but it may not be necessarily the most efficient way. Through design, maybe they can improve the design, we can reduce some of it. But again, this could be a multi-pronged. That's why I think whether economic growth hurt or improve environmental quality at the beginning when I asked the question, I think the answer is both. No? You can actually both hurt the environment, you can also improve the environment, depending how we look at this issue.
And I think just to add, I think that really this brings home the point that this is truly a multi and interdisciplinary issue that I think Mr. Koo, you have really articulated in some of your thoughts. There is actually a very good question I want to just bring in. I thought I'll just add. There's actually the questions are starting to develop in our chat list. This is from Ngo Kang Min. I believe you are addressing it to Mr. Koo. What is your take on the status of green spaces at the rate we are developing right now? I think you may have answered indirectly. So, but I wonder if you have a direct answer to that, Mr. Koo.
Well, I live, my flat, my apartment is facing Dover, that stretch there. So I've got vested interest to want to keep it, right? But I think if you look at the density that we're dealing with quite successfully already in Singapore, then really what is stopping us from going all the way to say that, look, every patch of green needs to be preserved and even intensified. And could we reduce our footprint systematically over, say, the next 20, 30 years and increase the green? Could we, as we build, also green on top of what we build? And I think the answer is yes, we can. So we can actually, and we can even design this forest so that it's not just an ordinary regrowth forest. It could be a forest targeted at high natural capital value that meets all the provision. Maybe it's even producing medicine or woods or some of food that is really unusual, or we could even be creating like a biodiversity bank as we are doing this. So there is, I think, a lot more we can do, but the question is, are we willing to give up of some of the things that we have now in order to have this biodiversity? And I think we are making the small little steps. And I think if all of us were to really speak up and think of, like, you would like really think in a bold fashion and not just continue with business as usual. And as we find out more, to really advocate for it, because today, with social media, the voice of the many can be heard faster, and I would say the government has no choice but to really respond to some of these emerging needs. And I think the Singapore government has really responded, like, for example, this Dover green issue. They have paused to rethink, right? They may not have reversed it, but they have certainly said, okay, look, okay, why don't we just pause for a while, And instead of developing this entire stretch, could we take everything that we wanted to develop and just maybe develop along the edge or something like that? So you can start to think very differently if you see differently.
So I thought perhaps at this point we can share the poll questions just to give some context to some of the earlier, when everybody was came into the webinar. So can we show the poll questions, David? Okay, so this is the poll questions that we have asked. With us a few questions. The first one, and you can choose a few, being what do you think of when you hear green spaces? What do you think of when you hear green spaces, right? Greenery is well maintained, greenery that's left untouched, like forests, greenery that is located in or on buildings, example rooftops or indoor gardens. So when people think of green spaces, they usually think of our manicured gardens as well as nature. I think that is pretty obvious, right? The next one being natural green spaces, specifically forests and nature reserves, must be protected and should never make way for new developments. Wow, we have a good number supporting this. You look at strongly agree is at 47%, agree is at 26%. So more than 50% agree or strongly agree. If a natural green space has to be cleared for development due to our limited land, what should be the key consideration? The overwhelming result is biodiversity living within the green space. Okay. And the last one, different types of natural green spaces, spaces with low trees and bushes versus spaces with mature trees and vegetation should be valued equally. I think there seems to be a struggle. So there is, of course, agree and strongly agree 58%, and then disagree at 30%. So there's actually a 1 in 3 thinks that, it should not be valued equally. Sorry, 1 in 3 should be valued equally, so it should not be valued equally. So a lot of people seems to think that it should be valued equally. I wonder if they thought through the questions of the fourth questions especially. So maybe I'll just open it up to the panel. What do you think of this poll? Kang Min, you want to add your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's very heartening to see that people actually want more green spaces, and not just the manicured ones, but also the wilder green spaces. But I think, like, if you did this survey 30 years ago, I think you will get different answers.
What kind of answers?
30 years ago, people would still, we were still a developing country. People are not as well off, on generally speaking, and so there's, in those years, I would say that the willingness to conserve green spaces at the expense of economic development is not so strong like today, I think.
Okay. I have one question by Maurice Alfonso, and he posed the question, building upwards uses more resources, so what gives? So a trade-off questions, I suppose. Mr. Koo, you want to take that? Being the architect among us.
Yeah, I think this is the interesting thing. If you just look at our buildings, basically, cement really comes from the earth. It's a calcium and lime and all that, and then you put in granite, and you actually mine the steel from the ground and the earth. Glass is really sand that has been pressed and heated up. So what are we doing? We are basically transferring around materials and putting a certain pattern to it in order to reuse it. Are there easier, like better ways to build? The answer is yes, there is. But what's really strange? Nobody would pay for, say, a steel building that is like super lightweight, totally recyclable. That means 30 years time they can dismantle and reuse the material. they would rather pay for the heavy concrete. So this is the reality of what we are facing. We could build lighter, better, faster, more circular, but the market might not be able to absorb it because they will go around knocking on the walls and say, hey, this is too horrible. In China, there is this company that I met. They built a 50-story tower in 20 days. Yeah, so for them, putting up a 4-story block, a school, for example, is an overnight job. Basically, they design all the parts in the factory and then they assemble it on site very rapidly. And they use mainly steel and lightweight materials. So yeah, these are, I think, and in Japan, America, and in Europe, it is not unusual to see lightweight construction and lightweight. It's just that in Singapore, we haven't really quite gone down that road yet. But I think eventually we will, because we look at all the office towers in Shanghai and all that, they are really still lightweight. So eventually, when they have dug enough cement and made things heavy enough, we would then decide that, okay, we are going to change. I don't know when that's going to happen. Maybe Prof Sing, you can.
So the answer of course is it's possible, right? To use less resource materials, but somehow in Singapore, the choice, your preference is still more towards the more resource intensive materials. I want to take this opportunity. Sorry, Mr.
So maybe I just add on to Peng Peng. I think in terms of design technology, we are able to build higher. I think one of the motivation because of land costs in Singapore, land is scarce. I think building high upward may be one way to overcome this land scarcity kind of issue. By building higher, we can actually improve the land use efficiency. At the same time, we can create more green space. Green space is something that I think it's not just environmentally pleasing, but also generate better air quality. But there's also issue about why people paying a higher premium for green to have more green space. Is it because really people appreciate the environment quality? Is it because of you want to preserve the green space and reduce some of the pollution? So I think if you look at the similar kind of idea when we talk about green mark certification, we do find interestingly, I think green mark certified building, maybe Peng Peng can actually correct me if I'm wrong. Green mark certified buildings supposed to be more energy efficient. Whether people paying a higher premium because you can save more energy in the long term, because this energy saving cannot occur overnight, it's probably take a long time before you can break even, because the technology are much more expensive and more costly in order to build in. A developer usually quite hesitant to use this green mark technology, but because of the premium, they're actually willing to invest more. The other motivation of developer or even people paying for green mark premium is not so much of energy saving. Because of the ESG, the environment kind of motivation, people want to associate with the greener kind of environment, greener space and so on. I think people are willing to pay a higher premium. Some company, Western company, as MNC, they actually particularly specify in their lease contract, they only will take space with a green mark certification. So they call it green lease. So that actually increase the demand for some of these green space. So they are more and more willing, the more and more developer willing to actually invest in green technology and get the building certified green. So it's the same thing. For example, Prius and Toyota Prius, the hybrid car and also the fuel car. Both actually is not functionally, they are not different, but one is more expensive than the other. Why are people willing to pay the premium for getting the hybrid car compared to Toyota? This is also an interesting story. Is whether people paying for the energy efficiency or is it because it's a greener car? So I think there are a lot more study we need to look at. Do we encourage more people to pay a higher price for the green car or hybrid car? Or should we tax more higher more on the fuel petrol consumption, and that means force people to move to the green car? I think these are different ways we need to actually balance and evaluate. Because I think it's the same thing when we talk about organic food as well. You know, organic vegetables, more expensive. Does it taste different? I'm not sure. You know, probably we need to do a lot more research. Why are people willing to pay more organic vegetable and so on? And this is an issue of trade-off, right? And if you don't pay a higher price, if you don't support the green farmer, what will happen to the green farmer? It may not be able to sustain or may not be able to produce enough to cover the cost. So
I have a comment on that, Prof Sing, because sometimes we think we want to eat organic, but actually this is also a response to Alfonso's comment about environmental impact. We are actually not getting the truth about environmental impact. And I think this,
sorry, Mr. Koo, this audio is not coming out clear, so maybe you adjust your mic up.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, some of these organic farmers, they are leaching their nutrients into the water system and into the rivers as well. Just because they're organic doesn't mean the impact is less. And if you just look at cars, for example, why do I want to put 1,000 kilograms of metal together just to carry 150 kilograms of human around? And why do I need to travel at 200 kilometers per hour in the city? Why do I need a car that is so powerful? You see, this is the whole thing about the way human beings think, that we really need to change drastically. In the city, you buy a Lamborghini, you are still going around at average, 30, 40, 50 kilometers per hour. Why do we go for a Lamborghini? And we have to go for something that is lighter than we are. Like, it doesn't make sense, you see? So at a certain point, we have to really get behind the truth about what we are making, what we are needing it to do, and how we're going to do it in order for us to be really green, because it has to make sense. And technology is capable of doing so much. The question is, are we applying ourselves in a new way, or are we just going to take old solutions and think them? Right?
So perhaps at this point, I want to ask our audience, if you have any questions, you might want to ask the speakers directly. If you could raise your hand, let us know, and we will spotlight you, and you can show your face and ask the questions directly. So I was thinking perhaps we can just open up to all the participants. David?
Some I actually had a point to add.
Okay,
actually,
maybe we at that point, yeah.
Yeah, there was a question somebody asked, about whether it's possible to move a forest. And I think it ties into the question of whether we should be building higher. So a forest, I mean, if you think about it, how are you going to move it? So first of all, a forest is made of the trees, and so you would have to move the trees. Now, how are you going to move trees? First, you got to cut their roots. Then you got to put the roots and the root ball into a big bag, and it's going to be carried by a crane. And then you bring it to the site you want to plant it in. And so, in the whole process of moving a forest, the trees, big and small, you might actually just, end up using the current technology we have, you might end up killing half of the trees, and you're not going to get back the same forest again. So I would say today, it is impossible to move a forest, but you can move buildings, you can move roads. It's expensive, but the technology is there. It's possible, just not forest.
So forest is one of those where once it's gone for a
very
long time, permanently.
Yeah, either if you want to get rid of it, you have to cut it. Yeah, it's a permanent loss.
Okay, a permanent loss.
It takes a long time to establish the ecosystem.
Yes, takes a long time to recover. Like we have, like I explained just now, even after more than 100 years, the secondary forest at Mabuchi is still not recovered yet.
That's a good point. So let's bring all our audience in right now at this point. We are at the tail end. 9 o'clock, 30 more minutes to go. So I thought maybe we just bring our audience back into the conversation. And if you have direct questions you want to ask, please feel free to show hand and we will spotlight you and you can ask your questions. So David, can we show all our audience? Any takers? Anyone has any questions? Anyone has any questions to spotlight? Oh, no one has any questions to ask. All wants to ask in the chat group.
Hi, sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, if no one has any questions, maybe I'll just raise my hand in person here.
Yeah, I have one.
Okay, we'll come to you, Maurice. David,
Okay.
you wanted to ask?
So I have a very fundamental question, and it's ironic because we organized this webinar, but much of the narrative has always been pitting two choices against each other. For example, this webinar was pitting protecting green spaces against maybe holding off development. I just want to put it out to the speakers here. Is there a better way to frame this narrative and this discussion, right? Where it's not so much of a choice between the two, but it's actually better to marry the two together. Is there a way to harmonize these two concepts together? Can they coexist? That's my question.
Good question. Do you have anyone in mind you wish to direct to?
I think it sounds a little bit of economics question, but also open to Dr. No. Yeah.
Well, I mean, David, I think it's a very good question. You're talking about the issue about trade-off between developments and protecting the green. As mentioned, I think the answer is actually both. We can also hurt the environments, can also at the same time, we can also have to improve the environment. If there's no right or wrong answer in this sense, because you look at economic development stage, because at the country, at this early stage of development, what's the priority? You want to create jobs, we want to provide more housing. Sometimes people tend to neglect the environment kind of issue. When the society become more affluent, when you actually meet the basic housing need, people start to think about having not just a housing, not just a roof over the head. You want to have a better house, you want to have more green home and so on. I think the technology can achieve some of these, but I think the certain trade-off, certain costs involved as well. So I think one of the participants, Vinish, also mentioned, we cannot apply all these climate goals at different countries. I think I agree with you, as you say, at different stage of developments. I think it's difficult to enforce on different countries not to cut the forest and keep the forest status quo and at the expense of economic growth, because I think at different stage they need to create jobs as well. I think that urbanization, development growth at different stage, they may have some of the forests may have to be sacrificed in a sense. So I think against this is a question we call it paradox optima. How do you make someone better without making someone worse off? Is there a way to overcome this? Or is there a way, like what David said, to integrate this? It's difficult to implement it, but there's a way to actually overcome. It's like some country in sort of preserve certain environments, and is there a way to provide subsidy or different way of grants to help country to create job, but at the same time to keep the environments intact and so on. It's not easy solution, especially when this problem involve country in different country in different across different border.
So I think if I may just add, and I think that's a very good question, David, and good reply, Professor Singh. But perhaps my view is that one word keeps coming to mind when I hear the speakers speak, especially Mr. Koo, the point about being creative and thinking out of the box. I think we think creatively and we think out of the box, we actually can solve a lot of problems. And I was and I still am rather intrigued about Singapore as a test lab, right, of development which we can replicate across the world, and other people taking our model as a basis to emulate. But I want to also bring in Maurice. I believe, Maurice, you have a question. Can we spotlight Maurice? You can show your face, Maurice.
It's okay. I'm in bed, so I rather not show my face.
Okay.
Okay.
Your question?
No, it's to Prof, and also answering your question about this EKC, right? In the early stage of our development, we were, of course, consuming a lot more oxygen and expelling more carbon dioxide because we were in that phase where we were using resources to do a lot of our stuff. And now we have outsourced this resource to poorer countries. So therefore our carbon dioxide has fallen. And I don't think it's a very good reflection. Hey, we should clap our hands and say, we did a good job. Maybe we didn't, okay? We have taken resources from other places and we didn't add that to the resource that that shows that our level of carbon dioxide is falling. Maybe our total consumption package has really increased our level of carbon dioxide. Anyway, I'm not a CO2 guy, right? So you should know that. But since that chart was shown, so I just have to try to address the issue a little bit. So we have outsourced that big consumption, big production of carbon dioxide to other countries who are now making our clothes, making our shoes, making things that we were doing before. That's my question.
Aslam?
So the question is, could we have outsourced it, right? Is that your question?
Aslam?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Oh, unfortunately, my video is stopped, but do you mind if I chip in at this point?
Sure.
So I think it's a very good question. And to follow on from what has just been said and what Maurice said, I think when we think of how we change the trade-off, it can be a very exciting journey. And it need not be incremental, sort of constantly optimizing moves. There can be some bold moves as well. So for instance, what Mr. Koo spoke about housing and new concepts of housing precincts, housing blocks, and how you can free up a lot of land is actually a very bold idea. It doesn't sacrifice one or the other, but it designs things differently so that you change the trade-off completely. There's one example. A second example that we have to think about is for industries which are inherently more carbon emitting or pollutive, do we, and Maurice was talking about this, do we simply outsource it to another country, which may very often typically be a country that will do it even less efficiently? Or do we want to be pioneers in the transition towards a greener petrochemical industry, a greener this industry or that industry, and make bold moves to be part of that transition globally rather than export the problem somewhere else and make ourselves look good statistically? That's the second example. A third example, which I don't know very much about, and I think our speakers may know, will know more about, is the converse, which is, are there examples of biodiversity which offer economic value? And I can certainly think of examples of that nature in the large countries with very large tracts of land. But for a small country like Singapore, are there interesting ideas where biodiversity itself could bring economic value? But it's the same mindset of trying to change the trade-off. And fourthly, it's about consumption patterns. We can actually enjoy life and have a very high standard of living with a very different pattern of consumption, most especially with regard to food, but also clothes and many other things. So actually we can think very boldly about how we just change that trade-off without having to choose between a high standard of living and protecting and in fact strengthening biodiversity and the whole ecosystem.
Very good. I would like to ask the panelists who would like to take and answer those questions.
Can I just chime in? As I was researching this whole idea of natural capital, I think in a lot of businesses today, the tangibles are very easy to measure, but the intangibles are often, a lot harder to measure. And one of the intangibles could be our natural capital. And I think large companies like Pricewaterhouse has started to gather, the biggest corporations in the world to start thinking about natural capital protocols. So, for example, natural capital has now been broken up into, say, four aspects of like provisioning, regulating cultural values, and supporting ecosystem. So, we are starting to give value to the services that are provided by biodiversity, and are starting to be able to measure the kind of, for example, nutrient cycling and primary production and soil formation that's like supporting even spiritual aesthetics and recreational value brought by biodiversity. For example, our Mandai natural theme park, and certain regulating functions like carbon sequestration, water filtration, erosion control, and even materials output like water, fiber, genetic material. So we are making headway in science to try to put a value in our natural capital. And I think we are also developing ways that we can measure. So I know a company that uses drone technology to be able to scan water locations and caverns in the grounds and all these things to be able to see like below the ground. And there are other companies that measure carbon, biodiversity, and biodiversity mass. So we can actually start to put numbers to some of this carbon emission and all of these to make sense of the truth behind our patterns of consumption, beyond just measuring it with, say, demand or just by dollar value, for example, to be able to tag it with other kind of values that we can associate with what we are doing. And I think if we are able to do that successfully, then the true picture of our ecological impact footprint can be seen and can be traded and can be measured. And I think this is where I think we need to move towards. And I think it's an amazingly exciting time that we're in. And I think if, we grab that, take that challenge and really meet it head on, I think we can really be a real model for a city that is forward-looking and becoming more and more sustainable and responsible at the same time.
Yeah, maybe I will respond to the question about trade-off. Interestingly, when we outsource these productions from Singapore to other country because of the land prices is so expensive, I think some manufacturing had to be relocated to other third world country. Would that become more pollutive, or do we export pollutive? I think there are two ways to look at this. One, maybe looking at this from the perspective of the production functions. I think by outsourcing or relocate this factory to third world country or others less developing country, it may not necessarily generate more pollution or emit more carbon dioxide. If you look at it, if your production plants is old and not efficient in the expensive land, it actually generate more carbon dioxide. When you relocate this plant to a new country, a different location, a developing country, if you can improve, actually promote more green car production. In fact, you actually can reduce the pollution. At the same time, you can either increase the production or even keeping the production. So there's always this trade-off when not necessarily that by outsourcing, we're actually exporting some of this pollution to another country or to increase the pollution. But to solve this problem, it's not so straightforward. For example, I think for example, carbon emission kind of issue, people are thinking about using tradings and using quota pricing to deal with this problem. Is there a way to price this, for example, carbon? Can we actually trade this carbon emission by charging companies that emit more carbons? That is issue that a lot of countries is looking. It's not so easy to measure the carbon emission, how much to price it, how to establish this market to price this carbon emission and so on. So I think there's definitely a solution, but I think a lot more work needs to be done, especially to quantify, to measure some of this carbon emission and also how to price this carbon emission and so on. We really need a very established institution and system, and also have to be able to apply this across different countries as well.
I'm not sure if anyone has answered this question, but I thought I'd just recap. I thought this was a very good question asked by SM. Are there examples of biodiversity which can give us economic advantage? Are there examples around that we know that can give us economic advantage through biodiversity?
Yeah, Aslam, I was going to.
You were about to answer that? Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, so high diversity, biodiversity in many studies, it has been shown to be equivalent to high ecosystem services. So things like, carbon sequestration, floodwater management. And these are intangible services. They're not directly economic. So perhaps there are other studies that try to monetize these services. But really, these are services that are intangible. But another contribution of diversity to human economics and healthcare is in medicines and drugs. There's so many compounds out in nature. These are what the plants and animals have evolved over the last millions of years, and they have perfected the art of responding to emergencies in nature. They are constantly fighting diseases, enemies. And so there's a lot of things that we can learn from nature, harvesting of their compounds out there that we are still discovering new species of plants and even animals in Singapore. And so who knows, whether the next drug or medicine could come from our forests. And actually to give an opposite point of view from what we can read from nature is the cost of disrespecting nature. And that's what we are seeing. COVID-19 is a perfect example of disrespecting nature. And it's, because people were eating things that they're, eating wildlife, things that we should not be eating. And, ended up that there was a disease from an animal, it got passed on to a human. And so we are, living in this pandemic right now. And so, there are so many things that we still don't understand about nature, and that, nature should have its at least I think that nature should have its place to live and to flourish. And we humans should not, without understanding nature first, we should not, disturb them too much. Otherwise, we risk another pandemic. And also, I think the points that Mr. Koo has mentioned, the health benefits and well-being benefits of diverse forests. Actually, this can we measure that in economic terms? And the last question is actually a philosophical one. Does biodiversity, does nature need to have an economic value to justify its existence? This, if you say no, then maybe it doesn't make economic sense. But I think that this is a question where we can see if our society has matured to that point where we don't need to rely on diversity to say that we can live well enough. That's all from me.
Very good. Thank you. I see, Francis, you have put up your hand, so you could unmute and ask your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Aslam. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Point about biodiversity in urban settings and economic advantages. And also SM's point about a radical or a fundamental shift in our thinking. I think firstly, the observation is that the narrative around the world, when it comes to climate issues, green and all this, is that we tend to apply the same yardstick. And I think that a tiny little country like Singapore, with limited land that we all know, needs a different set of yardstick that shouldn't be applied to Indonesia because they got a lot of land and so on. On the biodiversity aspect and the structure we think, I often felt that the way we build our reservoirs, for instance, is taking advantage of our natural terrain. All the rivers are dammed, and the low-lying areas, the British, I don't know, 200 years ago, allocated McRitchie and so on. That's fine. But there are advantages and disadvantages of centralized everything from power generation to water to central services. We like the concept of efficiency that we think we can get from centralization. But if we think about landscape, for instance, and biodiversity, we can actually have completely distributed reservoirs going forward. Basically, we have reached a stage where polluting our reservoir is no longer a risk because everywhere waterways are now reservoirs. In designing modern towns, it is possible to build large tract of waterways embedded within each of these new towns. And they could be deep and not so deep. And for the deeper ones, for safety reasons, we might need to put some kind of, I don't know, stainless steel or whatever material nettings that is a certain level below the surface of the water, maybe a meter or meter and a half, so that you can still have water sports without the danger of falling into these 10-meter deep waterways or whatever. And the advantages are, for instance, if our reservoir are poisoned due to whatever, due to terrorist sabotage or whatever, it will take a while to get rid of those chemicals. And also a centralized water treatment, for instance, the sewage water that we centralize to treat, it requires, okay, we use gravity there, but when the water is done, it requires energy to pump all over the place. So if we decentralize water treatment to every housing estate has got one or two, the risks are lower, the pumps needed are smaller, and they can be adjusted to demand pressure demands during the day. When there are less people using, automatically the pump pressure will be cut down and so on. And then, of course, with the waterways like Punggol, there's enjoyment, there's scenery, it cools down the ground. And the other part about urban design is that I think architects and town planners like to use height variation. Maybe we should, in some aspects, turn it upside down. Basically, instead of having 10-story blocks, 30-story blocks, 60-story blocks to vary the landscape, we can build sizable aero bridges that house 10-story blocks mid-air from 9-story onwards, for instance. This will give a shade, wind flow at the lower levels, but it requires one thing. Singapore's development model, partly by our developmental progress, we started with 10-story HDB flats. We knocked them down, we built 20 stories. We knocked them down, we built 40 stories. I think that's a complete waste of resources. But in earlier years, we had no choice, we had no money. So we better build cheap housing, low rise, they are least expensive to build. But if we, from today, were to plan an entire Tengah town, assuming that there's no flight problems with aeroplane or fighter jets and so on, we can build 80-story buildings for 1/3 of Tengah town. And then 20% of it, the buildings start from the 10th floor. Structurally, they are linked together. I think in terms of earthquake resiliencies, they are probably more resilient. Yes, it will cost a bit more, but then we have to make a decision that concrete RC or steel structures can last 300 years if they are properly maintained, and we shouldn't knock them down after 20 years. It's a complete waste of resources and reworking everything. And HV flats could be designed such that they are all shells. They are all shells, and they are not you know, 2-room flats, 3-room flats. They are all shells such that they can be configured as the population ages. We can change them from a 3-room, a 4-room flat into a studio unit even, so that the people are familiar with the area. Okay,
Francis,
I'll
thank
end
you
there.
so much. Yeah, we are actually at 9:30, so I was just wondering if you know, everyone could just bear with us for a bit. And I also want to ask if our speakers are okay to just give us a few more minutes, because it seems like the, you know, engagement has increased, and I see a nod and a okay from the speakers. Thank you. We actually have a poll, and I know that it's quite at the tail end, but I thought maybe it's good. My team says that it's really good if you could run the poll. So if you are all okay, we would run the poll. It's also data for us to understand how you all think. So let's run the second poll. And if you could very quickly answer the polls, that would be great. The second poll, yep. Thank you, David. Okay, so the poll has started. If I could get everyone to answer the questions, thank you.
So Aslam, maybe I can
Sure.
say something about what you mentioned about creativity and design thinking and all that.
Okay.
I think rather than thinking either or, you know, we shift our thinking to both and. So could we have both biodiversity, green spaces, and quality housing that we have? I think this is the challenge that we have, and I think whether we end up living taller or in the sort of dense low-rise environment, I think certainly diversity, choices, and all that must be factored into meeting the needs of the people. And I think architecture design today, we are moving into also being able to replace more than 100% of the greenery. So if my building uses 1,000 square meters, I could provide, you know, another 1,500 square meters of greenery, or maybe even doubling that. And we are also even able to design natural environments, curate some of the plant types by, just having more knowledge. And with water, we are changing the way we design water systems from fast discharge into sponge urbanism. So we are starting to think about how to absorb the water like a rainforest. Coming, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, up to, you know, sometimes up to 3 or 4 meters, it's acting like a sponge that absorbs water, and in dry season it discharges the water. So we don't have the very earth store water for us. And I think ideas like that can and should be implemented more and more. And I think we will. It's a really, to me, it's really exciting because we have all of these capabilities that we should really just take advantage of, and as a nation decide to be the most innovative green nation on the planet. And that is where the value is. It's not, it's also the intellectual property and that we generate just because of the need that we are in, that has become of value to all those around us and whom we touch. So for example, I'm working on a water project in Africa, and I can look at the land is dry, and that's because they cut down all the forests for firewood. And to me, that is a really, really sad thing that we take down entire forests just to burn it to cook food, you see. Could we do it some other way? And I think the answer is yes, we can. And we can now even learn how to afforest really dry land. So human beings have the capability to destroy, but we also have the capability to build. And I don't think we should see that we are a small nation. We should be a small nation with huge, big ideas for better.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think that's a very inspiring message for us all, and I agree with you. I think Singapore does have the wherewithal to develop all these opportunities at this stage of our development. I just wanted to say that, you know, we have 42 out of 57 who have answered the polls. If you have not, we're going to close very soon. So very quickly answer it, and then we'll show the results. So this is just a quick shout out to everyone. Okay, we're going to show the results in a few seconds. And all right, let's end the poll and show the results. Okay, so the first question, I would love to live near a forest or nature reserve. Resounding support. Okay, resounding. So 70% agree on this or strongly agree. Second question, I think natural green spaces should be cleared for new developments. Do you agree? A lot of disagreement. There's actually about a third neither disagree or agree. Interesting. The next question, housing must always come first before keeping natural green spaces untouched, right? Housing must always come first before keeping natural green spaces untouched. Do you agree? So again, strong disagreement, but actually quite a number, about a third again, neither agreed or disagree. So it looks like there's still some residual belief that, you know, housing has a lot more value than green spaces, it would seem. Next one, a natural green space after being cleared for development can always be recreated and regrown. Do you agree? So clearly a very strong disagreement there. Okay, thank you all for completing the poll. We are actually really over time, and I'm conscious of time, everyone's time who have signed in. So I thought perhaps I would allow our speakers to just give your summary comments, keep it short, maybe like in a minute. What are your parting comments to everyone in our audience who have, regarding this topic of green spaces? So perhaps Kang Min, you started first, right? So I was wondering, Mr. Koo, you want to start first, then we end with Kang Min and Professor Singh in the middle?
Okay, and I'll just say one thing, you know, I always bring my students out into the wild, into the forest, into the sea. I think we got to get to know the very nature around us that we are made of, and to start to love nature. And once we fall in love, then we will do everything we can to protect it.
Sorry, Mr. Koo, it was breaking off. Couldn't hear you.
Yeah. So if my students, if they really do not know, they don't have a relationship with nature because they grew up so far away from it, it becomes an academic thing. But when they start to learn and they see the beauty and they experience the joy of swimming in a waterfall or snorkeling, looking at corals and beautiful fishes, they start to feel that connection, and then they really put their heart into working at new ways that we could relate to nature without looking at it as a sacrifice, like a trade-off. We change the way we relate and the way we see and the way we value. And then we can start to cry when we see how much we have done wrong, not respecting rhythm, timing, the way the earth beats, not understanding that we are part and parcel of the very material that makes the earth. Thinking that we are something separate, looking at the earth, rather than we are one and the same. That carbon, that oxygen comes from the earth, goes into earth, comes from earth, goes back into the earth in a perpetual cycle. This is what we need to transmit to all our young, that they can start to love and care. And that's it. Let them innovate. Let us all innovate from that side.
All right. Thank you. Professor Singh?
Yeah, just to add on what Francis had mentioned just about the vertical intensification of the land use. I think this is quite typical in Singapore. We have to build higher to, because of land resource, scarcity of land resource. This actually also leads us to the question about, given the limited land resource, will we be able to urbanize at the same time to keep the forest? This is the question of trade-off again. Not easy to resolve this issue. And because I think when we talk about this trade-off, the EKC curve, that's what we're talking about, the EKC curve will break down if there are other problems we cannot control. Like, for example, we mentioned about externality and also the free rider problems. How to deal with this problem is something that, again, you require a very clear and transparent, also enforceable kind of rules and regulation to make sure that this thing can be minimized.
Okay, thank you. Kang Min?
Yeah, thank you, Aslam and team. Actually, it was very good sharing. Thank you for organizing this and having me. It was good for me to get a sense of how people value different sorts of green spaces. And I also agree with Mr. Koo that connection to nature is very important when we think about valuing these green spaces. And I would further add that, this connection to nature should be cultivated from young, because there's lots of research have shown that the experiences that people gain at childhood follows through to adulthood. And so I think, exposing our children to green spaces, to wilder green spaces should be done from a young age.
Very good. Thank you so much to our three speakers who have kindly given your time to us. In fact, more than the time we requested. So we are very grateful for that. I thought I'll just do a very quick concluding remark of this session. When we first started our series of webinars, we actually didn't know where it would take us. And when we started, we felt one of the biggest issues was really the fact that we don't know a lot of things about the topic of sustainability, the topic about green. These issues are complex. They have a lot of interconnections with other subjects, economics, for example, interfacing with, the choices we've made, but also, the fact that there are options in design and innovation and technology that Mr. Koo talks about. And how then do we value the fact that if we remove a primary forest, it goes away for a very long time? What is the price of that? So I think topic like this, by bringing experts from different fields, allow us to understand the complexity of the issue of sustainability. And I hope in today's session, we have done that. And we have prompted, maybe through some discomfort in the conversation, maybe a little through some very deep scientific expressions and sharing, which our illustrious speakers have kindly taken pains to put slides together, which we are very grateful. You walk away learning one thing or two things or more. But I think where we come from Green SG perspective, we have evolved our name from Sustainable SG to Green SG, really to reflect the importance of biodiversity, I think, in this whole issue of sustainability. So with that in mind, we hope you have taken some valuable lessons. I felt like a student, by the way. I had a lot of questions I wanted to ask and, had that interactive dialogue with our professors, but I felt it was better to let the audience have that opportunity rather than the moderator speaking. So I hope I've done that. And last but not least, thank you all for also being such great audience, to patiently attend this, go through the whole program with us. We had about 100 over signups, and I see we have about 60 still here. We have about 80 who attended. So that really is a testament to the efforts we have put in. David, can we just, before we go, just show the quick slide. We have a post webinar feedback. The QR code is here. We really would be grateful if you could take some time to complete that feedback questions. It's for us to learn. Every session we learn areas which we feel we need to improve on, that you feel we have done well. Let us know so that we can continue our work. So I'll just leave the QR code there for a bit. And I also want to say a big thank you to the team that has put this whole event together. The silent ones at the back. Special thanks, of course, to David, Suchen, Sadia, Hui Jin, Brian, Junhee, Zach, and Lokman for actually working behind the scenes to bring this together. They have helped in research, they have helped in organization, and on the day itself helped in putting the program together. So let's give them a big virtual round of applause. So with that, and they are a very young team. so I'm in good company. So with that, I thought perhaps a big thank you to everyone again. David, the next slide. Do support us. We have a Facebook page. We are in the midst of changing the name of the Facebook page, but do follow us, like us. Every now and then we post. We are all volunteers, and we post information on the Facebook page so that we can share about what we have done. We have recorded this event. We will cut snippets of it and put talking points. And once the video is ready, we will post it on our Facebook page so you can still recap some of the points shared by the speakers today. So with that in mind, thank you all for your time, and have a very good evening. See you all in the next event. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, Professor Singh, Mr. Koo, and Dr. Ngo.